Call the meeting to order. Please stand for the pledge.
Pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Let the record reflect that we have one director absent. Okay, it's a truth and taxation for the payable 2017 levy. And Jeff, take it away.
Well, we've, this is our annual taxation meeting. Oh, sorry. This is our annual truth and taxation meeting that we're mandated by law to have, and we are fortunate once again to have Kathy Erickson from ARC come and do our presentation. So take it away, Kathy.
Thank you, and thank you for coming. Are you property owners, constituents just here to
They're
learn?
future school board members.
Oh, congratulations! Oh my goodness! Well, especially thank you for coming then, because this is what I like to call the Super Bowl of school finance, truth and taxation. Each year, every school district must certify a levy that they're going to spread on their district's tax base for the next calendar year. And interestingly, the way the process works is the money that we're going to be collecting in calendar year 2017 is actually going to be for the next fiscal year that starts July 1. So the things we're doing now are actually kind of a delayed reaction to what we're doing. So a year ago when I was here and visited and you approved that levy, that's what we're recording right now in the fiscal year that we're in. So it is kind of a 3-year process as we kind of go through in all the different pieces of the levy. So tonight, we'll be sharing information about your levy certification. The other requirement for truth and taxation discussion is your budget. And because you're in transition from a business manager, I have some general budget information, but I will then defer to Randy, and most likely you'll be getting a revised budget sometime in January. ARC will be working with Randy to just kind of review the budget. We work on the revenue side at ARC pretty thoroughly, but the expense side is yours, is local. We don't always have the information about your staffing or other expenditures, but we'll be working through that process, so you'll be getting a revised update. But what you'll see is just a general budget that's currently in your finance system, and then we may see some adjustments sometime. And it's very common, January, February time of year, that we would review the budget, see how things are, and then possibly request that you would do a revised budget at that time. But we'll start out talking about the levy certification. Did everybody get their proposed property tax statements? Was anybody surprised? Did everybody feel, I don't know if you've heard regionally, but there have been several counties who are reassessing properties quite aggressively, which is a compounded effect on your property taxes. So we could have our levy going up X%, but reflected on a tax statement where the assessed value of the property went up, it's going to compound that increase even higher. My city that I live in Two Harbors, we are seeing about double what we expected to see on our levy because of assessments. My friends up in Cook County and Grand Marais, they have a YouTube video out. Their truth and taxation was 1 hour and 43 minutes long 2 nights ago. They had a lot of people at their truth and taxation because assessments and their levies were going up, which was causing a lot of questions. The good news for Eveleth Gilbert is your levy is going up approximately 5.23%. So overall, a very reasonable amount. We'll see what our region is doing, and we'll talk a little bit about the factors that are leading to a little bit of that change. If you see this chart that you have, and you have one in front of you as well, the first category is what we call referendum market value voter. This is your operating referendum that was voted on. So you have an existing voter approved referendum, and that's the category that we collect those taxes on. It is just changing slightly, and the reason that is changing is because pupil counts at the time we're estimating, and now we're getting final from prior years, and those are getting adjusted. You always get paid on final pupil counts. But because we have to predict what's going to happen in fiscal year 18, and we're not even close to being there, we put our best estimates in the levy. They give us some authority, and then they correct up to 3 years prior when we get final information. So The result of that category going up or down a little bit is the result of pupil counts becoming better or final. So that's why we're seeing a little bit of a change there. Your RMV other category, this is a new collection of a couple new revenues plus a couple old revenues. One is our new local optional. Local optional is the category where every district has the authority to levy up to $424 per pupil without voter approval. This was mandated by the legislature. The districts have the option to levy that or under levy it. You are levying that. It also includes the $300 board approved referendum. So it could have been in the past considered voter approved, and then every district converted $300 of their voter approved, moved it into board approved. So same revenue stream, it's just in another category because it's now no longer voter approved. And almost every district in the state converted all those, again, through legislative changes. So that's why we're seeing, we oftentimes might see those two categories combined together to look at the net difference because some of them are the same revenues, some are voter approved, some are not. Any questions on those RMV? So just a note too on referendum market value, I didn't put in some taxation slides that I might have done in past years, but referendum market value is based on a taxing structure where seasonal rec residential and ag properties over the house, garage, and 1 acre do not have to pay. Now in Eveleth, you don't have a lot of cabins and you don't have a lot of agricultural property, so the spread levy, or the pool of people who are paying into that pot, is very similar to the pots that we're going to talk about when we get to net tax capacity. But what's important to know in RMV is that every property value is equal depending on the classification. So if I have a $100,000 house, you have a $100,000 commercial property, we are going to pay the same amount under RMV. When we get to net tax capacity, which are the next columns on our graph here, it matters the classification of the property because certain types of property are going to pay more or less based on what type of property they are. But under this referendum market value, we say it's blind to classification. So homes, businesses, apartments, timberland, all those pieces of property would pay the same amount based strictly on their value. RMV properties also do not get the homestead market value credit. For all of us that own homes here in the taconite assistance area, you get a little rebate on your taxes called a taconite homestead credit. That is only spread on the net tax capacity taxes. So the referendum market value is a straight up levy with no credits attached to it. So it's a true sense of how much do we need to collect from our taxpayers, how do we spread it on our wealth, and then that gets distributed. The next category that has something in there is called General Net Tax Capacity Other. Now you have a little bit of dollars in there, and normally this is a line item that would get wiped out by your taconite. And we'll talk a little bit about taconite when we get through, but as many of you know, in the taconite assistance area, our levies are reduced by what we call taconite production credits. Taconite industry does not pay property tax. They pay a per tonnage tax, and that gets distributed to all the municipalities, including school districts, as a deduct on our property taxes. If we actually had mines having property wealth and property tax spread, our levies would look completely different, but this is how the law has us calculate this. So there's actually quite a bit of expense under NTC Other, over $600,000 of expenditures, but it's being wiped out by your taconite reduction, and we'll look at that on a different slide. But why you have a little bit of money there is a levy that's called Student Achievement, and the levy is not allowed to reduce that to zero. I'm not sure why, when it was created, it wasn't moved up the pecking order on how taconite gets reduced. So it is the share of your general education levy or general education aid that must come in the form of levy. And it's been cut about in half or a little more than half because the legislature is phasing out that tax. They're going to try to get that to go away so that all general education revenue will come as aid instead of this tax rate levy. Many years ago, for those of you that have been in the school world for a long time, our general education revenue used to be around 30% paid by our taxpayers. There used to be what we call the tax rate levy, and it was about between 37 and 30% over the years. And when Governor Ventura was elected, he eliminated the tax rate levy and said the state's going to pay for all the general education aid side revenue. And so for a little while, it came back as what they called the student achievement levy. It never really gained any legs in the legislature, so now they're phasing it back out. And we'll talk a little bit about the general NTC other when we go into your summary reasons. Community service looks like you have zero, but you also have expenditures there, but that gets completely wiped out by taconite. In the pecking order of taconite, community service is first, so that one always gets wiped out. Your debt service voter, this is where you have voter-approved general obligation bonds, and they look like they're going up, but this is the result of some prior year debt excess penalties that lowered your levy in a prior year, and it's coming off and just looks like an increase this year. Happens every other year or every third year, very common, nothing to be alarmed about. This is your share with adjustments again coming through over multiple levies. And then the final category that has activity in it is your OPEB bonding. So back in 2009, 2010, your district voted to sell bonds to put money into a trust to help pay your retiree benefits. And many districts up here did that, and you are now paying those dollars back. Now, your levy is actually much higher than the $32,000 or the $13,000 you're seeing, because once again, this part of your levy gets reduced by taconite. And the reason it went up is not because your debt went up, is because your NTC other needed more money this year because it had more expenditures, and in order to wipe it out, it had to pull money from OPEB bonding, because in the pecking order it goes community service, NTC other, OPEB bonding. So next year, for example, if your NTC other expenses go down, it could wipe out your OPEB bonding completely. So it's kind of hard to explain. This is kind of complicated with the taconite pieces. But overall, your OPEB bonding was very stable, but it looks different just because of taconite. How are we doing so far? Does that make sense? Okay. This is your levy by category. This is the same levy. This is a pie chart saying where are we collecting dollars from on your levy in percentage. And you can see that the biggest chunk of what we're collecting is your referendum market value other. Now, if we were not a taconite district, you would have pieces of your pie that would include community service and NTC other. So your pie is unique compared to other districts I go to that don't have taconite. So again, just because we might see this pie, keep in mind you have all kinds of expenditures, but they're being replaced by those taconite dollars. So again, you still have many other pieces, but this is how your net levy ends up after we get reductions for taconite. Wanted to just touch briefly on taconite. We talk about this every 4 years. You can see that the taconite production that you receive replaces about 45% of your levy. If for some reason the taconite money went away, your actual net levy for Pay 17 would be $1.2 million we'd have to spread on your taxpayers. But because we get a reduction of $555,290 as a taconite share, your net levy in that last column is the $691,712. So without that taconite as a replacement, your net levy would be that $1.2 million we'd have to spread. So again, about half and half. Depending on the district, in the taconite assistance area, we have districts who are very close to yours. Yours is a very favorable percentage. We have other districts who get less taconite, and we're in like the 5 or 6% range that it only replaces. And then we have others that are maybe closer to 20 or 25%. So a 50% reduction because of your taconite reduction is a fairly favorable reduction compared to other districts who receive levy funds. In addition, in your debt service, you also receive taconite bond assistance. So 80% of your taconite bonds are also replaced with the taconite bond payment because you're in the taconite assistance area. What I wanted to make note is if you could look at that taconite share row, please note that we are continuing to see a reduction in your taconite contribution on your levy. So back on the Pay 14 levy, which we would have talked about in the winter of 2013, and I may have been here to visit with you, I would have shared with you that you had a very similar levy of 1.2 million, but that time around you had gotten over $714,000 in taconite reduction. And now we're down to $555,000 as a reduction. So just so that's notation for you to be aware of, we are seeing the industry with its ebbs and flows. When production is down, our contributions go down. It is a 3-year running average of a contribution, so we get cushioned by any large sways, but if we were to see a loss in mining, we are going to see that reduction go down as well. Yep.
Is the taconite tax based on a percentage of the tonnage, or is it, is the tax a percentage of the tonnage, or is it a percentage of the value of the tonnage? Does that make sense?
It's a cents per ton.
Per ton, okay. So it's a constant percentage of a ton. It's not
Correct.
Like if taconite's $100 a ton versus $50 a ton.
Doesn't matter.
It doesn't.
Yep.
Okay.
The law can change. It hasn't
Right.
changed. But we get, inside of that 555,000 are actually 4 different pots of taconite. So there's a general taconite, and then we have other pots that are different pieces of it. But right now the law is consistent. It's the amount of tonnages that changes. And then also, it's also partially based on enrollment. So if the enrollment of your school district is declining, that will also play a small, not a large, but it will play a partial factor in your total taconite production calculation. Bob Wagstrom, who's at the Department of Revenue, who is my guru when it comes to taconite production, reminds me every year that the calculation in Excel to figure out that $555,000 would be as long as this wall. It is a recalculation, a repecking order, a recalculation, because the taconite assistance mines and districts have to share the wealth. When certain ones are doing well, they must give part of their wealth to some of the mines that aren't doing well. So those districts who might be suffering a little bit share in some of the wealth, but it's always a lesser of situation. So we're not always, we have limits of how much we can get per year, but if one is doing well, then we share the wealth with the other districts so they don't have a loss. Back in 2008, when we saw the taconite tonnage go from around 40 million tons to 17 million tons. Do people remember that time of year? I remember it well. I lost a lot of sleep over that. And we actually got special legislation because the law said if there wasn't enough tonnage to generate what was on your levy, you were going to lose levy dollars. They didn't have enough money in the pots to give you, way back then, probably closer to $750,000 or $800,000. We worked with the range delegation and RAMs, and we have language now that says if the production doesn't meet what's on our levy certification to pay, they'll take the money out of the taconite homestead pot, which happens to have, at least at the time we were looking at it a few years ago, over $50 million in it. So again, if production wanes and our levy says you're entitled to $555,000, if the production process says, oh, I'm sorry, we only have $500,000 that calculated for your district, the other $50,000 would come from the taconite homestead pot. So that was a pretty last minute language change, because even the Department of Education had never seen this happen before, that tonnages had gone down so low that the calculations weren't generating enough revenue for you. So just as something to be thoughtful about, note those production, and then note your levy. Your levy has been fairly constant. You did have a little pickup on the Pay 15 levy, but you've been at about 1.2 million for the last 4 years. And through no fault and through no other changes, your levy will go up if our taconite production continues to decline. So that is a factor in that 5% change. Part of that is just that we've lost almost $20,000 in what would have been a production reduction on your levy. So does that make sense? And I know some of you are in the taconite world and kind of know more than I do. I just kind of hear the general trends, but those ebbs and flows are common. We've been through it now a few times over my last 11 years at ARC, but we never know what's going to happen. We have a new legislature, we have a new people in the majority, and so those people that have really supported taconite may not have that same level of influence. So be vigilant and pay attention to what's happening at the state level on what's going on with taconite. Whoa.
Oh, that was a nice presentation. Oh.
Woo. Sorry about that. Oh, this is one of my favorite, you guys. So each year, we go out, after we get your initial levies calculated, we go out and find out what other districts similar in ADM size to you, so similar in student size to you, what are they levying their taxpayers? And let's just say for the record, not every district can I display this, because some of our member districts, that middle one is way high and the other ones are lower. And jokingly, at our last meeting, we had a few districts, one of your neighbors, Mountain Iron, their percentage is way high, their levy is going way up, but they're still, I get to show this at their meeting because they're still well lower than similar sized districts in amounts. So percentages are one thing, dollar amounts are another thing. But this can just go to show you that similar sized districts with pupils just over 1,000 pupils, we can see that your levy is significantly lower than districts similar in ADM size to you, which is quite unusual. And again, because of the benefit of taconite, that is also helping keep your levy lower. For example, if we didn't have taconite anymore, your 692,000 would be 1.2. So again, you'd still be lower, but you'd still be in the market. Now keep in mind, just because they have that amount of pupil, what we spread on is important, tax base. So their levies might be higher, but what they get to spread on might be much more wealthy than your community. So again, dollars are one thing, how we spread those levies are another. But that is one of my favorites. Any questions on the levy? So the levy is going up a little over 5%. I think last year when I visited here, it was going down 11% or almost 12%. So again, that was due to adjustments that had happened. So even with that leveling off, we're still at a lower levy than we were 2 years ago. So again, your levy has gone down over the last couple of years, very stable, and you can see that on that taconite graph. If we don't have any questions on the levy, I'll just talk briefly about your budget. So what ARC does is we go into your finance system and we pull down whatever levy has been recorded. Now you know that a budget is a living thing. So it can change. As soon as a board takes action on something that isn't in your initial budget, your budget changes. When your pupils counts change, your revenue changes. You don't take action at every single board meeting, but someone's keeping track of all those changes so that at some point in the future, you'll be asked to do a revised budget, because we don't know all the answers by June 30th when you're asked to adopt a budget. So for right now, what is in your Smart Finance budgeting is a current projected deficit of $464,000 in the what we call the UFARS general fund. This includes your regular general fund, your transportation fund, and your operating capital fund combined. Your transportation, if I recall, has always been in deficit. So a big portion of that $464,000 is because you do have a transportation deficit in your budget. Just as clarification for transportation, on a state level, there is no transportation fund. So we do that on a local level to identify what transportation costs and assumed revenue based on what the department tells us. we could consider transportation funds, but they do not recognize transportation. They say you're on your own, and if it costs you more money to transport because you decide bus routes or other reasons why, you're on your own. So many, many years ago, there used to be a dedicated transportation fund. There is no longer a transportation fund. Many districts, it is their cash cow. If you're a large district like St. Louis County, they get what we call transportation sparsity due to how many square miles they have in their district lines. Lake Superior School District, Cook County School District, Grand Rapids School District. The number of square miles determines how much extra funding you might get what they call transportation sparsity. Because your district still is significant in size, but not as significant as some of the larger districts, that transportation sparsity isn't as high as other districts. Does that make sense? Okay. Your food service fund is currently showing a slight deficit. I suspect this is adjusted about halfway through the year after you see trends of what's happening in your food service. I don't think it's been outrageous one way or the other. I think it's been fairly stable over the years. And oftentimes we'll do a projected deficit, relook at it halfway through the year, and then we do a revised budget there. Your community service fund does have a projected surplus compared to revenues versus expenditures. This can happen in June because you may not know all your programming when you do your initial budget, and then since then there might have been other programs and services added. So when you do a revised budget, you may see more expenditures coming in that might get that closer to a break even on your community service. For both food service and community service, we call those one-way funds, which means your general fund can give those pots of money dollars, but you cannot take money out of food service or community service to help your general fund. So because your general fund is in deficit, you might say to yourself, oh, let's take that $76,000 and help the general fund. We're not allowed to do that. So just know that if your food service or community service is in deficit, you could, by board action, transfer some of your general fund to help those funds, but you cannot go the other way. Your debt redemption fund, again, very common here to see a slight deficit. This is the result of your debt excess penalty. What happens here is, over time when we collect debt service dollars, they force us to levy more than what we need because, believe it or not, some people don't pay their property taxes on time. And you are required to your bank to pay off those debts. And so the state allows you to over levy, but you can only collect so much in that over levy. Then they recalculate it for you and say, I need you to spend some of that fund balance down, and we're going to reduce your levy on your taxpayers so that you don't accumulate too much of that extra bonus money. So we would see a deficit in revenues versus expenditures when you need to just spend down a little bit of your fund balance because we have some excess funds in that fund balance. So very common, nothing to be alarmed about there. Your trust fund, very small. This is most likely scholarships or other local revenues or expenditures that you're hosting on behalf of someone else. I don't have the detail behind this, and Jeff, you might know, but oftentimes this is just maybe a small scholarship that you're hosting on behalf of someone.
It's a holding tank for a scholarship.
There you go. Your OPEB trust fund, which is Fund 45, the irrevocable trust fund, we would expect this to be negative because you went out and sold bonds back in 2009 or 2010, and you have a big fund balance, and now you're just spending that down. And so each year you're spending down what we call a fund balance or bank account. And the way our system works is you're showing some revenues that are coming in, which are probably employee shares that are paying off their share. And then the difference is what you're paying off for those OPEB trust health expenditures for your retirees. So we're just reducing what you already have as an existing fund balance. And if I'm not mistaken, next week you'll be hearing your audit report.
Yes.
Your auditor will share with you what those fund balances are. And they're just getting finalized right now. So they will explain, and that's very common, again, to see a deficit in the trust because you've got a big pot of money sitting there that the intention is to spend it down. And then finally, your OPEB debt service fund. Again, this is the principal and interest that you're paying off of those dollars that you sold bonds for back in 2009 or 2010. And again, a slight deficit, minor debt excess penalty here very common. So the net change overall, you can see the largest one is in Fund 1, but again, of that, most of that, a big portion of that is your transportation fund. And then your other deduct is your OPEB trust, irrevocable trust, which again, we have an expected deficit there because you're spending down a fund balance. Any questions on the revenue expenditure budget? And again, I'll be working with your new business manager. Several of our folks at ARC will be working over the next couple months to kind of give them the crash course and what's super awesome about school finance. Yeah, question?
Our royalty money, is that just a part of the general fund
It is.
revenue? Okay.
Correct. By law, there is no set aside for that, but at a local level, you could choose to set that aside.
Well, we've been line iteming that on
Yes.
our internal budget, but.
Correct.
Right.
Yes. The state of Minnesota recognizes that as local miscellaneous revenue. One of the graphs on the expense side that I just wanted to briefly show you is this is your expense by program for all funds. So this is funds 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 45, 47. And what we see very commonly is that the biggest share of your expenditures is in your elementary and regular and secondary instruction. So these are your teacher salaries and benefits, which is a big piece of that, plus all those things that are in that what we call the 200 series. It's the education of kids. Normally, what we've been seeing as far as a trend is that special education instruction has been running in close second place, not close to green, but would be our normal second place, which we're seeing growth in expenditures in special education. Now, special education expenditures are part of your students maybe in a regular classroom part of the time and then getting special education services. Those are those services. So again, a student could be getting education in both regular instruction and special education. On yours, we can also see what we call pupil support services. These are going to be contracted people, and what we see especially in areas where you have a shared cooperative for special education, a lot of your people, rather than them being employees, they're in your contracted services area. So again, we're seeing that pupil support services, again, a little bit higher. But what I wanted to note for you is your sites and buildings being, some of our member districts see that in about 3rd or 4th in the ranking. In your case, it's in 2nd place. It's the 2nd highest expenditure is your sites and buildings. And I know this comes as no surprise to you. I see you all shaking your heads. But again, that's just something to note, that those areas, that's where we're seeing where some districts, especially now if you see districts who have new buildings, their sites and buildings is getting smaller because they have less deferred maintenance. When districts have older buildings or multiple buildings, we see more costs associated with the buildings. So again, just wanted to make note of that, and just again for your reference. The final slide in my pie charts, I believe, is just to show you what your levy is as part of your budget. I don't know if you ever hear from constituents or you've maybe thought yourself before you became on the school board and had started to love school finance as much as I do. A lot of people have the misconception that their property taxes are your budget, that they're paying for everything associated with the school. And if you look at your total budget for all funds versus what your levy is, that contribution, and again, your current year budget is your last year's levy, that's why it says payable 16 instead of 17. Your levy is only contributing 5% of your total budget. Oh, geez. Excellent. I think we're going to make it. But just so you know, I have some districts who are at the 29 or 30% mark, but that's of the highest districts that we have. So again, yours is very small compared to what we see for other districts. So again, I think that's a message that you might want to share if people are concerned about their taxes, which they should be. But again, of your total revenue budget, your levy only contributes 5%. This is just here for your reference. We've kind of walked through some of this. On the tax statements, when you get your taxes, those categories that we saw get combined into either voter approved or other. So that's what we see on the proposed property tax statement. So they won't know if your voter approved is a bond or your operating referendum. It's just the voter share. And then your other is anything that's non-voter. So if anything should change in between those categories, that's what changes on the levy, on your proposed property tax statements. And then just a quick note about net tax capacity. This is where classification matters. And this is where if you own a commercial industrial property, it gets taxed at a higher rate than a homeowner. And it gets taxed as a higher rate as a seasonal rec cabin property, or even as an apartment building. So of the classifications of property that we have within any district line, the commercial industrial has a higher proportional rate than others. And when it comes to homesteads, we get the homestead market value exclusion, which actually reduces the taxable property wealth of our property. And I'll just use this example off the top of my head because I use it at every session. A $100,000 house. So if you have a house that's assessed at $100,000, you're only going to get taxed on $71,760 of it. So basically, a little bit less than a third of it is not taxed. So you get basically a little deduct. But if you have a $100,000 apartment, you're being taxed on the full $100,000. Only homesteads get that homestead market value exclusion, and it's proportional. The more value your property has, the less credit you get. So if you have a $300,000 house, you're not getting a third off. You're probably getting about 5 or 6% off. So again, the more wealth you have, the philosophy, I guess, is the more you can afford to pay. So again, the lower the wealth, $76,000 house is the max. They get a 40% discount, and then it gets retroactively smaller as we go down. And again, the legislature is the one who determines whether a tax is referendum-based, which then a business and a home pay the exact same amount, or net tax capacity-based, where a property that's a commercial industrial will pay a higher rate than a homeowner. So again, just in summary, your levy is going up for a few reasons. New long-term facilities. You guys heard about that new long-term facilities revenue that popped up last year? There's a 3-year phase-in of those dollars, and your revenue authority increased by $100 a pupil from last year to this year. So you're getting a little bit over $100 more a pupil as authority, but for you, over half of it is aid. So that's great news for you. So of the dollars that we're getting in authority, you're getting a big chunk of it in state aid. We have other districts who are very property wealthy, where that $100 a pupil is all coming on their levy certification. Your OPEB debt service, again, appears to go up, but this is because your net tax capacity other, where that new long-term facilities money is kind of hidden inside of there, is going up, so we needed more money to wipe out that NTC other. And your referendum market value voter went up again because pupil counts got better. We have better estimates and some final, and then those were adjusted. And then finally, your taconite revenue went down a little bit, which is causing your levy to go up because we have less taconite to put on there. And I think that's all I've got. How'd I do? Oh, gosh. I was at Reamer last Thursday, and we looked at the clock, and it was an hour and 10 minutes. There's a lot of people asking questions, though, but we were an hour and 10 minutes in, and I was still on that pie chart slide. I was like, holy cow. So I think a lot of people were learning to love school finance in Reamer. So with that, does anyone have any questions? Was this helpful for you guys who are new? Sorta? You know, feel free to reach out to your superintendent, and if we need to get some information or other slides.
Didn't see that one coming, did you?
Did you see that little? But just if you have any further questions, just let us know, and then we can follow up with you. And and I know MSBA puts on great trainings for new school board members. So if you're new and you're going to that, ARC doesn't work directly with school board members without the approval or working with your superintendent or business manager. So we wouldn't just pick up the phone and give you a call, but we would certainly come up and do a training with you, or we would certainly work through your superintendent or business manager to get you information. So never feel like if you don't understand something, you don't have someone to ask, because I can talk about this stuff every day for the rest of my life. So with that, if you have no other questions, what would happen I think it's going to happen at your next week's meeting, so you're not taking any action tonight. You'll be certifying that $691,000. Your business manager will have that sheet for you that will explain what that final certification is. We turn that into your county auditor, and then they will spread those taxes on calendar year 17.
Okay.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks a lot,
Thank you.
Kathy.
Thank
Appreciate it. Anything else?
That's it.
Okay, I guess we're adjourned. Thank you all for coming.